Hello everyone, welcome to week 3 of the class. Thank you, Kate, for the reel, cutting that together again. Yes, as people were saying in the chat, all green, thank you. People were saying good works and congratulating everyone, and I completely agree with that. There was a lot of really nice texture work done this week. You may have noticed again that I have not graded everything yet. While we have had a number of people fall off, which is typical with the class. You know, week 1 is most participation, and gradually it gets less each week. This, I think, I haven't done the math to know if this is statistically true, but I think this is one of the most, the least fall off that we've seen from week 1 to week 2, meaning everyone's still, not everyone, but most people are still participating. So that is awesome. I like to see the commitment from you guys. However, it does still mean that I'm going to be a little bit slow getting to all the grades, but yesterday I spent all day grading and got to about like 25 or so. So I'm going to aim for finishing that on Wednesday, but thank you for submitting. Thank you again, Kate, for cutting that into a reel. And was there anything else? Not particularly, I don't think. So yeah, we're going into week 3 now, and we're doing shading and lighting, and this will finish the like project portion of the class. We will have one more stream next week just to wrap everything up nicely and look at week 3's homework. But this week it's shading and lighting. So week 1 modeling, week 2 texturing, and then week 3 shading and lighting, and our project will be finished. So as is normal, we are going to start by going through some week 2 homework that was notable, and there's some things to learn from them. So we will start first with N647. N647 has been in previous classes, but got a late start in this one and really did a lot of work in week 2. He did week 1's homework and week 2. So not only did you do a lot of work in 1 week, but you did a very high quality job with both the model and the texture. Now, the model to me looks very evident as being inspired by the treasure chest project in the course, but you totally made it your own. I love the subtle details like the handles on the side. That's very practical for how something like this would be carried, and I just didn't think of that at all when I was making mine. I love the fleur-de-lis detail. I love also the square diamond rivets that you used instead of the circle ones. That's a subtle change, but I think a very effective one, and I really like the more edgy nature. It kind of like a hands-off feel to the model, and yeah, so the model I think is really, really well done. And then on top of that, the texture is really, really good. It's got this excellent painterly style to it that I can absolutely see in a video game. I feel like this is professional quality work. One thing that I really, really like that you did is you added a knot in one of the boards. For whatever reason, that never entered my brain when I was making mine, and I totally wish it did, because this little knot here is very interesting to look at. It makes total sense with the board, with what the treasure chest is made out of. And the fact that there's only really one, it looks like you started another one down here, but it's not a duplicate. I just think that's you're showing that you have an understanding of how to add variety that makes artistic sense, but also practical sense. And the way that you varied your details, none of it seems repeated. Which I would assume that you did use the the data sharing so that it is repeated, but I see no evidence of it. And overall, between modeling and texture, is just a really, really good job. And you also went further as far as simplifying your input geometry and then using modifiers to create the rest of the shapes. So like, for example, how you used a single, rectangular shape and then duplicated it and bent it around into a circle. There's a really clever and interesting post about that in the forum thread. So if you haven't seen that, check out N647's homework thread. He talks about, they talk about their process using the modifiers to achieve this. Really interesting stuff, full of good tips. And yeah, so check that out. Thank you, N647, for joining, catching up in spectacular fashion. And we will move on next. I have a question. Is there a tutorial on the barrel? There is no tutorial on the barrel. The idea with the master plan was to release the treasure chest course where I teach everything you would need to know to create the sign, the barrel, and the sword. Essentially. I know some of them are a leap, like from a treasure chest to a sword especially, but that was the goal. And but I wanted to give you some freedom to also have a challenge in applying that information in a unique way. But no, there's no specific tutorial on the barrel. Though, I mean, maybe I can do that in a stream one day. You know, that's easy enough. All right, so next homework submission is from Clint Johnson, who was, I think, made the list last week too, because you were doing one of the more unique signs, and then you carried that effort that I saw in week 1 also into week 2. And this is another one of the more painterly, skilled painterly styles that I've seen, whereas I'm not a natural painter, and so I would not put myself in this category, but it seems like you really understand a painting workflow, how to apply that to a 3D model, the fact that your texture is very detailed, which supports your model, which already had good detail, and the two are working together really, really beautifully. Something that I saw in some homeworks is, and I can experience this, I've experienced this myself, primarily being a modeler, is that I can get to the texturing portion and not really put the same effort that I put into modeling as I do into the texture. And it ends up being obvious, like you have a really good model, but a lackluster texture. And I thought this was an excellent example where that could have happened, but it did not. You put a lot of effort into the texture, and it shows. And you were attentive to every part of the model. You've got this moss, which you can't really see when I hover that way, but you've got the moss on the ground with a couple little flowery bits like that. I would have just glossed over that probably if I'm being completely honest. But you were attentive everywhere. I think that's worth noting. And yeah, just the level of detail is higher than I saw in a lot of the submissions. So if you got that note from me, this is an example of how to put that level of detail also in the texture. And was there anything else I wanted to say about this? Oh, I do love the curly Q knots that you put in there. I think that's just a clever little artistic choice, and I think that's worth noting as well. But Clint, yeah, you also said that this wasn't really, I think, an enjoyable process for you. It was more difficult, so you're not sure if you're going to go back to texturing. I hope you do, because I think you've got serious skills that you should continue to develop. So don't give it up. Next, Aaron. By the way, Aaron, is it Rudderham or Rudderham? Is it fast? Is it pronounced fast or more explicit Rudderham? Let me know, Rudderham or Rudderham, if I'm getting it right. But Aaron, so your model, if you remember the feedback, and for anyone who didn't know, is the model to me read as a good, competent model. I could tell that there was detail in the model, but I also had some questions about the shapes, like what exactly was going on, especially in the more complex area. In the model, I just was scratching my head a little bit like, okay, I don't quite make out the forms quite as well. But then when I saw the textured version, like everything clicked and it all made sense what you were doing in the model. And to me, this is a great example of how powerful texturing can be, that looking back now at the model, it makes perfect sense what you were doing. And it just needed the texture to be fully realized. The fact that these pieces are different colors, whereas when in the gray model, I don't get that distinction. The gray crossguard it stands out now from the gold mesh that covers the hand when you grab the sword. And then the gold pommel, the dark handle, the dark grip, like all of it makes good sense now in context now that I see the texture. And especially in game art, I think this is worth noting that a lot of times to get a very efficient game model, the model by itself doesn't look that great or that notable. But then when you see the texture, they just work together in this concert, I guess. And that is true of this case, Aaron. I think you did an amazing job on the texture. It very much fully realized what you were building. I think that is at best what the texture is going to do. So excellent work there, Aaron. And to illustrate this a little bit more what I mean, I take it back to when I was learning computer graphics and Halo 2 was popular, and I was trying to recreate this mesh because I found a wireframe, the shaded version and the textured version. And I remember being kind of disappointed at the quality of the model by itself. Like, this is okay, like it's fine, but nothing is notable about it. But then you see the textured version and you're like, I mean, especially back then was like, wow, these graphics are incredible. And so much of that work is being done with the textures. But for the sake of the game, it's very highly optimized in the model. But to me, that's what it made me think of, the fact that a model can serve more of a utility than a pure visual benefit, I suppose. And the textures, it can be extremely powerful. So good job there. And someone else, Victor muv, move. This was another example where the model to me felt very competent. It felt like a sword, but it wasn't terribly a standout, compared to other examples. However, I saw your texture and it all clicked again. Like you added the rune details, which of course you're not going to model those. So it makes sense to add them in the texture. It makes sense to add these designs in the pommel on the ends of the crossguard. And yeah, just another example of how really good texturing can fulfill the model's purpose. And also, yeah, the detail in the dents and dings and the damage, you don't really see that well in the model by itself, but then when you highlight them in the texture, they pop, they just fit, and it's a really, really good example. So yeah, good work there. And did I miss any questions up to this point? Is there a Suzanne there? If you're asking about Aaron's, he did hide Suzanne, definitely. He painted the runes. Yeah, definitely. By hand. So if that's what you mean, you hand painted all of these runes. That's tedious. That's my hat's off to you for taking the time to do that. They look great. They totally fit the style. I think it's good. Wow, by hand, yeah. Blanche is asking, is it good practice to only texture details, not shadows and shades? And then the shader takes care of the shading so that a model reacts to the surroundings better versus just being shaded in the texture and it doesn't fit well in some scenes. So it depends on the situation. So many answers is that, I know. But there are some games, especially if you think of like older games in 64 or current games still do it too, like mobile games especially. A very efficient way to visualize real-time graphics is to eliminate shadows and reflection, specularity, basically the dynamic lighting where you see shadows, you see shading happen in real time. You can eliminate that entirely by making all materials like emissive or shadeless. And what we've done up to this point has been exactly that, like to make it shadeless, pure texture information. And in those games, you can add shadows, but you are always thinking about how to do it to not give away the effect. So like when I think back to N64 games, I never really noticed that there weren't shadows. There were all kinds of tricks going on to cover that fact. But it just depends on the situation. You definitely can do texture only, no dynamic lighting, but computation severity goes up whenever you incorporate dynamic lighting. But specifically, I'm going to go over this again, but like for week 2, I expected to only see texture information and no shading information. But I'm going to go over that in a little bit. I think this is the last one, a notable homework submission was from Mona. They, in the first week, I should show the thread for this actually. So week 1, did a very competent barrel. It served the purpose, but there wasn't much detail. And since there was the detail I was looking for in the rack that held the barrel, my main note was just, I would have loved to see that detail carried over into the barrel. And what I appreciate and wanted to highlight about Mona is, even though you could have been like, oh, that's a good note, I'll do that next time, but continue into the texturing, you went back, you heard the feedback, you took a step back and remodeled the barrel completely, and it turned out beautifully. So just an example of like sometimes in the artistic community, it can be hard to hear feedback and then act on it. Everyone reserves the right to decide if that feedback follows your own vision or not, but it does take a mature person, a mature artist to hear feedback and then act on it. So to those of you who have done that, I appreciate it. If you haven't, that's fine too. But this is a great example of this project just leveled up tremendously. And also, in addition to that, you shared insight about what you learned and how you performed the remodel. And one of the cool things is this graph that you shared with us about how you systematically create the smart repetition. So I encourage you to take a look at this thread and see what Mona had to say about that, because I just do it in my head, and by comparison, it's a pretty lazy approach to how you did it. And I just think that's really clever. Thank you for sharing with us. And then also, yeah, so being a week about texturing, your texture turned out very good as well. So, you did a lot of work this week, and I just wanted to highlight that. So I believe that is the last homework submission. Yes. Okay. See if I'm missing any questions. No. Excellent. a theme that I saw come up, or some uncertainty, I suppose, that I saw come up is how to present the texture, both how to paint it, but then how to present it as well. So the question, what viewport shading should I use for the texture painting process? And I wanted to quickly jump into Blender to talk about that a little bit, because for the sake of this class being more beginner oriented and trying to segment the workflow into digestible and reproducible chunks of work, I opted to separate texturing from shading. And so that's why week 2 was all devoted to texturing. And so ideally you would have you would have favored a flat shading approach. So flat shading, shadeless, purely emissive, like these are all often used the same way to represent no shading information whatsoever. And that's how I painted it last week. But some, I wasn't clear about that. So some people were showing like studio lit versions, or a matte cap, for example, which is fine. I mean, I would definitely in this scenario like look at that just to see how it's working out. Particularly, I think with the matte caps, like this metallic matte cap is most appropriate for my sword example. However, separating it from the shader part, which is what we're doing this week, your number one priority should be how to look at the texture by itself. Okay, so I expected that to be the presentation for your homework. And now that we're getting into week 3, we're going to be focused on how that texture influences the material and how to make them work together as desired. Because there is a disconnect sometimes between the textured version and what the final material looks like. So we're going to be going over that. And as you advance in your skills, you can paint your texture and see how it manipulates the material all at the same time. It's a really powerful workflow for Eevee. It can be very non-destructive, having layers of textures working together and influencing various parts of the material. But it is a more advanced approach, and it can be a rabbit hole that's hard to follow along. So for this course, I wanted you to separate them. So yeah, just to answer that question a little bit. Let's see, anything else? A question, would you say good texture painting requires a great understanding of 2D painting and drawing, etc.? I would say good texture painting does not require it. I feel like I'm an example of someone who has not spent a lot of time learning painting skills outside of texturing. However, if you do have 2D painting skills, if you watch Tim von Ruden's concepts tutorials that we have here and you develop those skills, it will only influence your texture painting ability for the better. I desire to improve my skills in that way. I just haven't done it quite yet. But I think I will one day. So I think you can make good, competent textures without having an extreme knowledge of 2D painting. But of course, you're going to be better if you do focus on those skills specifically. All right, so I think I covered that. Excellent. We're making pretty good time. Yeah, so now we can transition over to week 3. Great job, everyone, on week 2. Again, people are staying committed more so than in past classes, so I find that encouraging and cool. So this week we're moving into shading and lighting, where we take our plain texture and we plug it into a material. So the light will start to interact with the surface. We'll see shadows. We will see reflections. We will see how this part of the model is leather and the material properties that go with that, or this part is metal and likewise material properties that go with that. So this is, like, in my opinion, how the asset is completed. Once we get to this point, our barrel is finished. It can be placed in a scene or in a game and be finalized. So that's the goal this week. And the agenda, so what you're going to do is, if you haven't already, watch Chapter 3 of the Treasure Chest course. This is where I cover this process, and you can reference those videos as you need outside of the stream. And also, your homework is to create and finesse materials for your model, light it, and then present it in a final render, which we will get to by the end of this stream. I'll show you an example of what I mean by final render. Same thing with the course. It also goes over that. So I think that will finish off the stream, and I'm glad because I have an hour and a half then to do some Blender stuff. And when I say final render, the lighting and rendering portion is going to be probably the most simplified of rendering and lighting. We're not going to dive deep into lamps or anything like that. In fact, I don't plan to use lamps at all, but we'll get to that. You know, I think the main meat is the material. I think that's a little bit of a broader topic to digest than the kind of rendering we're going to do. So with that said, I think I'm done and I can jump over to Blender. All right, so we're going to pick up the project with where we left off last week. Having finished the texture, we can now start to pipe this into the material and manipulate these values. And we're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to incorporate a little bit of procedural flair as well. But for now, what are we going to start with? So we picked it up by putting the color texture that we painted just directly into the base color of principled BSDF. That's kind of the default material. And this is an Uber shader, as it's come to be called, that is designed to incorporate all of the main material properties you would expect for the vast majority of material types, from brick to plastic to metal to glass. Most of the things you can imagine it should be able to do. So yeah, that is an Uber shader. And if you are new to Blender, that's going to be all that you know. But if you've been using Blender the past several years, and specifically when Cycles got started, you'll know that Cycles was very Lego based, sort of. You know, like each element, the color element, lived in the shader diffuse BSDF component. All right, it was essentially just the base color slot here by itself, and then you would manually add the shader. Where is it? You know, a glossy BSDF to add some reflections, and it was pieced together like a Lego kind of system, essentially. And then when the principal BSDF hit, you know, it's PBR standard, so you're able to just plug all of these things into one material. So it's more efficient. There are some limitations, and I did a stream about that, but primarily it's what everyone's using for the majority. All right, so the first thing I'm going to focus on for the sword is going to be the metal, the metal for the blade itself. And also most of the items are metallic. So as I look at this model, I'm going to, the way my workflow, my mind thinks about the workflow is create something that you can possibly duplicate and then alter. And so since it's metal, if I create one good metal shader, I can then duplicate and tweak that to accomplish my other metal parts. And so I'm going to start with the blade since it's the biggest part of the model, and that means we need to quickly zoom into the metallic part of the material. But let me think about this. I wonder if I can rearrange my viewport a little bit better. I do want more room for the node editor because there's going to be a lot of action happening here. How about we switch to the shading view? Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that should work. I can optionally like rotate my sword also. Maybe I'll do that. That way I can maximize the use out of the horizontal orientation. All right, so I don't need the texture to be visible anymore. So we'll get rid of that and just make all of the bottom be a shader node. Uber shadering is happening. All right. Yes, I will try to go slow and make sense of this, but again, shading and node networks can become a spaghetti mess pretty quickly. So I will keep this simple as much as I can, but also want to open the box, Pandora's box, to what is possible with shading. It is so flexible. You can do so much with shader nodes. So I want to crack that open for you too. So about the metal, we're going to focus on this metallic slot right here. Out of all of these possible inputs, we're only going to be focusing on 2, maybe 3, well, 4, I guess, including the base color. But that one's the most obvious. But for the metal, of course, you would imagine we're going to crank up the metallic value all the way up. Now, what metallic is it's a type of reflectance model. I think that's the most official term for it. So it's reflectivity. That's what we're going to be adding to the material that is not there currently. And I'm going to turn off specularity because that's a different type of reflection we're gonna look at when we get to the leather. But for now, I have cranked up metallic all the way up, but do we really see much of a change? Yeah, I mean, we do. There's definitely a change, but it's a very rough reflection. Like it's not very clear. You know, if mirror is perfect clear reflection, this is very, very brushed metal at best. And that has to do with the roughness value down here. That, if I go low, that controls the mirror reflection. All the way to 0, it's a mirror. And then all the way up, it basically loses the reflection. It turns into a pure diffuse reflection. So typically when I'm dealing with reflectivity, I kind of orbit around 0.5 or 6 to 0.1, maybe a little bit lower. But that's kind of the spectrum. I'm rarely using glossiness in like the 0.7, 0.8 range because there's not much of an effect up there. And so we're going to be going down for a metal blade. We're going to be going down to like 0.1, 0.2. As I go down to 0.16, I'll try and use more appropriate, more like round values, I guess. So 1.5, not 1.5, 0.15, sorry. Everything happens between 0 and 1. Blanche's question, what does composition mean? It can wait until the wrong time. Yeah, so I plan to do just a tiny bit of compositing at the end. So yeah, maybe it can wait, but essentially compositing is like post-production. After you do your render, it's tweaking things with the images that come from a render. But you'll see what I mean once we get there. Any other questions yet? Cool. Seems I'm on top of it. Okay. All right, so I've got roughness set down to 0.15, and this is a good value. I think this starts to read as a metallic blade. Of course, you can decide, like, does this look too new? Perhaps 0.2 makes more sense. You could, I suppose, like take down some metallic value, like 0.8. So the lower you go in metallic, the more your texture color will be revealed. And so this can be a balancing act of like, if you want what you painted to be more authentic, then you can lower that metallic value. I'm going to hover probably around 0.8 if I recall correctly from rehearsal. I think I like that value. It still looks reflective and I think is reading like metal. The next step, and something that I strongly encourage you get used to and you explore, is the fact that if you remember when I textured, now that I said I didn't need it, here I'm going to open it again. I'm going to switch to the image editor and open our sword texture. If you remember from last week, I started painting with really broad color strokes and color gradients. But I was pretty quick to get to breaking up those color tones, making it a variety all over the surface, some dark versions of that color, lighter versions, and basically hiding a solid color anywhere. All right, so I call that breaking up the color. In this case, we want to use the same principle to break up the reflection. It's extremely rare in reality that you would ever have a purely reflective surface, with the exception of like a mirror. But even then, that mirror has to be completely new. There has to be no fingerprints or no dust collected on it. And it's way more common that dust will have collected, that fingerprints will be on it just from normal wear and tear and use. And so therefore, I strongly recommend that you always break up your reflective surfaces, unless it's, like a perfect mirror, which is rare. So to break up the surface here, we're going to use the color information from our texture, but we're going to manipulate it. Because remember, we highlighted the edges, the hard edges in the texture, or in the model, and so we can use those color values to make it either more reflective or less reflective, or in general, just make a variety of reflective values. And that's always going to make your reflection more interesting. But let me actually start to do this so you can see what I'm talking about. So it's common for me, whenever I have a texture like this, is to add a converter color ramp. By the way, I don't have my hotkeys. I don't think that add-on works in the node editor. So Shift A is how you add nodes. You can also add them up here in the add menu. Add, what was I looking for? Converter color ramp. All right, so the color ramp looks just like a levels control in Photoshop or Krita. And we plug in the color, and note that my color socket is yellow, but the socket I'm going into is gray. You also will notice that the sockets in the material have a similar color coordination. And, well, not similar, exactly the same color coordination. Yellow means RGB information. It expects your reds and greens, blues, yellows, all of that color information it accepts. Whereas the gray is representative of just the value slider. So value meaning 0 being black, 1 being white. And so I can convert, whenever I plug a yellow into a gray, it's going to come out as a black and white version of the texture. And here we can drag up the black flag to crunch the blacks. We can drag down the white flag to make those stronger. And now I've got a spectrum based on the texture that we painted that I can use to manipulate, say, the metallic value or the roughness value. Now I'm going to start with the roughness value because that is going to maybe make the biggest difference right away. So I'm going to plug this. Also, to reset the node, you can select it and hit the backspace key. And that will, I just learned that today. I didn't know that. So that is how you quickly reset a node to the default. And if we plug that just at the default into roughness, let's see if we get something noticeable. All right, so I'm gonna, that's with it plugged in. This is with it unplugged. And let's see if it can do that fairly seamlessly. Yeah, so you can see that now. And you can see that in the middle section, it got more clear. And the reason it got more clear is that if we look at that value, that color value, remember we painted that slightly darker. And as we go dark in the roughness slider, it becomes more mirror reflective. Let me remind you of that in case I forgot. You forgot. But that's what darkness does. Go dark and that's how you get clear. Go lighter and that's how you get a more rough reflection. So these black and white values correspond directly to that. Now, what I want to happen with the edge detection specifically, I want that to be more rough. Okay, so I do want that to be a lighter value. So I can crunch those lights down and then drag the black values up because that is going to be, for example, it's getting most dark right here at the base. Remember I said that could be like where mud or grime has gathered or dust and stuff, and that would also make that less reflective. So it makes sense for the dark flag to come up. Wait, I said less reflective. It actually makes sense for that to be white as well. So if I wanted that to be the case, I could add another flag by control clicking. If you control click on the color ramp, you'll get a new flag. You can change that to be white, this one to be white. All right, so now you can see that would be less reflective. And then you've got the dark spectrum in the middle, which I actually need to broaden. Let me add another flag and make it black as well. All right, so at this rate, if I plug it into roughness, we're going to get mirror reflection interspersed with very dull reflection. All right, now this is extreme. I don't want it to be mirrored, but you can see how the texture is now affecting the surface, and the reflections become much more interesting as a result. But remember, we never wanted it to be black. So the roughness value that we kind of landed on was like 0.15. So we can make these two color flags be 0.15. Now it's a little misleading. The value slider in the HSV does not correspond directly to these values. What you actually need to do is in RGB set all of them to be 0.15, and that will create the gray color that we're after. So I can hover over that slot, Control C, and then paste it to this black one, Control V. And now when I plug that in to roughness, we have that reflective value that we liked from before we plugged in the texture, but then we also get very rough reflections on the edges. And as we zoom around and see how the reflections kind of dance a little bit more interesting. It's more believable because a blade that's been through battle is not going to have a consistent level of reflectivity anymore. It's going to be scuffed, it's going to be dirty, it's going to have damage, and so this makes sense for how it would be presented. Also, well, if we look down at the dirt splotches, now they're hardly reflective at all. They're extremely dull. All right, so this kind of represents dust having gathered there, for example. Additionally, we can duplicate this color ramp with Shift-Control-D, and that will keep the input that it has originally. And I can backspace to reset the node. And let's think about how this would be effective as a metallic material, as a metallic input. So the darkness in this case would represent no reflectivity, no metallic reflectivity. And again, it sort of makes sense to drag up the black flag to eliminate the reflectivity from the dirty area where grime has gathered. And I'm going to change the interpolation from linear to be B-spline, so that way it's a more gradual change. So I think that that makes sense. Remember, I'm just paying attention to the blade. I'm not paying so much attention to everywhere else, but just the blade. And so what this would mean is that most of the blade is this gray value, which I don't quite know what value that is. But if I drag the white flag down, and then I can set that value to be 0.8 like we set up here for the metallic value, then this will reflect that, I guess, pun intended, 0.8. All right, so now that value is 0.8. It's not going to be more metallic than that, and we can plug that in. Let's see what that looks like. Shift Control clicking on Principal BSDF. Also, if Shift Control click does not work for you, it means you don't have the Node Wrangler tool enabled. That is a crucial tool at this point. It's a no-brainer tool to have on if you're dealing with shader nodes. So if you don't have that, go to your preferences, and in add-ons, be sure to enable Node Wrangler. And that is what enables the Shift Control click functionality of plugging in a particular node to the material output. So yeah, what did that do exactly? Now you can see at the base of the sword, there is no reflectivity. There's no metallic element to that. But then with the rest of the sword, we do have that reflectivity happening. So this is turning out pretty good at this point. We could, something to do and keep in mind with Eevee and as you're dealing with materials is to change up the lighting. So once we switched over to the shading workspace, it automatically enabled what's called Look Dev mode, all right? And that can be enabled here. This is the typical solid shading. This is wireframe, and this is Look Dev. The other one is your rendered view, which we'll get to in a little bit. But right now, Look Dev is ideal for establishing your shader material properties because it does a very simple, easy to use setup for seeing how this material would reflect in a lighting environment. You can change your lighting environment, which is typically what I will do, just periodically, shuffle through them to make sure they look okay in different lighting scenarios. So this one you can see is like an outdoor foresty kind of scenario. You can switch to more of a, looks like a downtown kind of maybe top of a building. So basically, practically just shuffle through them and make sure that your metal reflects in an appropriate way. Because sometimes they can reveal that your settings are off. And, oh, this doesn't work well in this particular lighting scenario, so I should alter that. They also have some dark ones. If whatever project you're planning is going to be at night, this is helpful for that. Also, you can turn off how it's visible in the background, which I typically do. So I'll just turn that off, the background slider all the way to 0. And I just find it less distracting and I can really focus on that material quality. But yeah, I think this is looking pretty nice so far. So yeah, just switching through these, making sure it looks good in a multitude of lighting scenarios. That one looks good. Well, in this case, it must be reflecting the sky in a very consistent way. On the back side, it's a little bit darker, but I don't know, maybe this kind of suggests that I should reflect more. Like instead of 0.8 in the metallic value, make that all the way 1. All right, so now we do see a little bit more reflection there. So, that's kind of informed a broader picture of what this material should be doing. But if I go back to the original or one of these, yeah, I think that looks fine. Between 0.8 and 1, there's not a tremendous difference. I still maintain the lighter color of my default texture. So anyway, I think that's going to be fine for now. But yeah, that is how this is going to be essentially the end of the first metallic shader. And pretty simple setup, but you can imagine how much of a rabbit hole it can go by using multiple textures and manipulating them for certain parts of the material. You can combine textures to manipulate the material in even more specific ways. So yeah, your node networks can explode in complexity, but also be extremely powerful too. My brain is already boiling. Well, it's not going to get simpler after this, but I'm going to hopefully make it digestible because, again, since we have so many metallic parts of this object, I'm going to be able to duplicate this shader node and then just manipulate that to be the next metallic shader. The next one will be in the center. So if we go back to look at our sword color by itself, I slightly darkened the center as just to, I don't know, distinguish, give it a little bit of flair, some visual interest by changing up the color. but also I can change this to be slightly different type of metal. So to make this happen, I'm going to go to our material properties, and I'm going to add a new material slot. That's that plus button right there. I'm then going to select the sword material, so it's duplicated, like it's using the same material in 2 slots. And then I'm going to duplicate that with this button that looks like 2 sheets of paper. And that I'm going to call, I should actually rename all of this. I'm going to call it Sword Metal B. And then the original one, I'm going to call it Sword Metal A. All right, so if you want to rename down here, just click on it and start typing. Up here, you can hold Control and click on it and start typing. So now we've got this, we're ready to manipulate the B version to be what we want. And if we go back to the material, one thing that I do want to be the case, wait a minute. Doesn't appear to be reflecting anymore. Oh, that's because, okay, that's right. So currently, remember, I created the new slot, but I did not tell it, I did not assign it to any part of the mesh. So Sword Metal A is still being applied to the whole model, and I did not plug up the principal BSDF. So when I do that, it's back to its reflective metallic ways, and Metal B, I need to assign to a certain part of the mesh. So now that I've rotated this, it's going to make it a little more tricky. Let me Alt-R to clear the rotation so I can make this selection. Control-Space to maximize, and how I'm going to do it, it kind of already had the selection, but I'm going to just do it manually again, is I'm going to select verts in wireframe so I get both sides, and then Control+ to grow the selection. All right, that is, I just want that center section to assign the metallic B material. And then Shift-L, I accidentally select some verts here and I don't want those, so Shift-L will deselect an island. And now I can just, in edit mode, you get new buttons down here for assigning this particular slot. So assign it, now that has the new material. We can go back to Look Dev, and then I can rotate this horizontally again. There we go. Maybe I should save the file. I don't know if the save police, if they've had any sirens go off, but I need you. I need you to do that. Shift Control S to add a new version. And thank you, Jake. Let me make sure I'm not missing any questions. Okay, I don't think so. So yeah, we're on Sword Metal B. Now, one thing I do want to do is darken it, because after I've plugged it up as the material, we don't really see a distinct darker metal in the middle. And so to do that, I'm just going to darken the texture with a node. And I can do that with adding a Shift-A, color, and RGB curves. All right, no, not mix. Color, RGB curves, and then click and let go of that whenever I hover over the node. And you'll see it turns white and automatically plugs in. And so here I can drag down the upper, I'm on the C color mode, so it kind of takes all the colors and just drops them lower. And you'll see that our middle reflection starts to darken. Okay, so we can make it really dark, still has all the reflective qualities, whoops, but just much darker. And I think that's a little too dark, so I think maybe about here. Additionally, I can leave this at the top, click in the middle, and drag that to the bottom right corner. That will also darken it, but it's a curved spectrum of that manipulation. So that's looking pretty good. I do think that I can dull the middle metal a little bit, and therefore the outer edge is what will reflect most clearly. So that means I can go down to this color ramp that's plugged into the roughness, and for the value of 0.15, I can make that the darker value in the spectrum. I can make that 0.3. Let's try maybe not 0.3. How about 0.25? There we go. So now it's a duller reflection, but I need this other one to be 0.25 as well. But I still maintain all of the variation that we get from the earlier, from the changes we made to the first metallic. So that's why I like duplicating this and just tweaking what's already there. Likewise, is there anything I would need to change about this metallic color ramp? Um, sorry, I was reading something about my soul and selling it for skills or something. I think that looks good, actually. I think that this is, I'm trying to keep in mind that I want to be authentic to how I painted the texture. So periodically it'll help to just switch maybe over to solid shading for, well, that's not what I wanted. Here we go. So switch over to solid shading so I can see what that material, what just the texture looks like, and then jump over to look dev. And so I can kind of keep them authentic, because applied to the metallic material, it could deviate from that. So that's just something I'm keeping in mind. But yeah, I mean the reflections again, I love how they're more interesting. They're dancing a little bit. The light dances on the reflections a little bit better. So now we can move on, I guess, to the third type of metal, which is the darker blue metal in the crossguard and also in the handle and pommel. So let's do the same process. We're going to add a new material slot, and I'm going to select, which one? Let's just go with the sword metal B so I can darken that blue again if I need to. That has that extra node up here at the top. So I will duplicate that material. Remember, it's important to duplicate. Interesting. So I did Control Z and it went into edit mode on the sword. So I wonder then if I know undo works differently in 2.8, but that's kind of annoying that I can't undo the duplication there. So I wonder if I change my preferences in the key map. Is that what it was? Or input interface? I forget. Is it system? System. If I enable global undo, will that, if I duplicate the material, Control Z? Oh, interesting. Look at that. So it removed the two slots and edit mode. That's several undo things that it did in one go. Completely honestly, undo is a little weird in 2.8, and I'm not fully used to it yet. But that's funky. That's funky. So let me... Oh, wait. Did that mean... Oh, no. So... Wow, I lost a lot. Look at that. I lost sword metal B. Like, there's no changes to sword metal B anymore. There's some bugginess when turning on global undo or off in the middle of a project. Oh, that's good to know. Whoops. Let me... I guess I'll recreate that. So let me save this. Maybe revert, maybe? Open number 5. Let me take a drink of water. And now I should still have global undo. Okay. Hopefully the wonkiness will be gone. But yeah, I need to rotate this down. I need to recreate metal B. Luckily, there wasn't much happening there. There wasn't much to change. I will add, make sure I'm on sword metal B. Is this assigned? So if you want to know if a material is assigned, you can use the select option. In edit mode, select, and it looks like nothing is assigned. So I don't know how to undo to get the rotation back. Alt-R, I'll just do it that way. Guess the wonkiness isn't completely gone. Let me select this again. Control plus, and make sure it's on both sides. It's not. Need to do that in wireframe. Control plus. Perfect. Okay. Assign that material. Rotate the thing down. And sword metal A, sword metal B. I'm in look dev mode. Okay. All I did, remember, was simply change the color of the dark metal in the middle with a color RGB curves, and then I think I just dragged the middle curve down a bit. Oh, and I also increased the value of this flag to be 0.25. Okay. Now we're caught up. I can control save. And next, all right, we wanted to add sword metal C. I'm going to add a new slot, grab sword metal B, and then duplicate it, and rename this to be C. Excellent. Need to assign it to the proper areas. All right, that's going to be, let's see. I'm going to start by selecting the leather because I don't want that part of it. Control I to invert, and then Shift L, the blade. All right, that's what I want to be sword C. All right, so we will assign that material slot. All right, and this one, let me think through this. It looks okay now, but I do want it to be, maybe have clearer reflections. Also maybe stronger reflections. Let's start with the clarity first. Since it is a darker color in general, like in the base texture, it's a darker color. It means I'll have to adjust the color ramp. So let me just reset the color ramp and start from scratch with the backspace key. And let's look at that. Let me think about this. So for the roughness, I do want the majority to be darker, and then the edges will be lighter. Let me switch to B-spline. Again, that is just a smoother crushing of the values. Something like this. Let's see what that looks like plugged into roughness. Keep in mind that you can plug into roughness and dynamically adjust those values. You don't have to just look at the black and white. Sometimes I find looking at the black and white is more clear, like more understandable. But in this case, it's not, you notice that it just doesn't quite look metallic. It looks a little bit like plasticky. And I think that must mean that the color ramp for it plugged into the metallic, yeah, okay, so we look at that and most of it is dark, which means very little metallic. This might be a scenario where I can unplug metallic and just use that value by itself. So it's a global metallic value. Now it definitely looks like metallic, and it looks a little too mirror-like. So that means that my roughness value is too low. Let me drag that up. Dynamically, yeah, you see that change dynamically? Okay, this is looking pretty good. Yeah, that's the type of metal that I'm going for. Very cool. So then, should I use the color ramp at all? I should invert it, right? So like if the edges are scuffed, it would be not less metallic, but maybe it would make sense for the underlying color to show through more. So let me invert the color ramp. So switch the flags around. And let's see here. When using the B-spline, I might need to add another flag at the bottom. That didn't really do anything. Maybe I should use linear instead. Okay, so now it's going to be less reflective on the outside, entirely reflective on the outer edges, entirely reflective in between. All right, so let me plug that into metallic and see what that does. There we go, material updated. And yeah, now it looks scuffed on the edges, which is what I like. Okay, excellent. I think that looks good. Control S to save. Okay, now I want to jump into another element of the shader that we have the ability to add, and that is a bump map. So bump map we've talked about normals and how you can soften normals of your mesh to give it, to remove the faceting. Well, within normals, you can also add a texture to fake a bump look to the surface, but it doesn't actually change the geometry. It's extremely prominent technique and really visual trickery in video games especially, but it's also used in all the applications, including like visual effects and stuff. So it's an important aspect of shaders. I almost said shadering, but let's add a vector bump, all right? In this case, I'm gonna start with the sword color and see what that does for us, but we will quickly run into a problem. So I'm gonna plug that into the height socket of our bump node. All right, so it takes the color information, converts it to black and white, and then when we control shift click on the bump node, you will see this rainbow version of our texture that is representative of a height map, like areas that are pushed in and areas that are pushed out. Now, in the black and white, black represents pushed in. So darker values is pushed inward and white values is pushed outward, okay? So that is how it interprets that information. And in a bump, you can see on the edges, it's kind of protruding out a little bit. So we really want to invert that. We want the edges to be pushed in because it's going to be scratched and nicked. Now, the strength at 1 is going to be way too strong. We want that to be like 0.1. We want it to be really subtle, frankly, because you also would have noticed that if we zoom really far in, we have this pixelation effect, and that is specific to Eevee. Cycles does not have the same problem. So you can use it without problem in Cycles, but in Eevee, you do have to be aware that when you take an image texture and convert it to bump information, it gets very pixelated. So instead, normal maps is what is the best way to do it. There's just not an easy way to convert in Blender, convert this information to a normal map. So that's kind of beyond the scope of this particular stream or class. Instead, we're gonna use the bump, but we're gonna be very subtle with it to avoid noticing the pixelation. All right, so we've turned the strength way down, and when we plug that into the normal value of the principled BSDF, we can see that bump effect. Now, again, when we're zoomed in really close, it looks terrible. All right, we do not want to see that. But when we zoom out into context, it really does help a little bit to just break up the smoothness of the surface, and it adds that much more detail feel to it. So even though it is a problem with Eevee, I still use it, but just use it more subtly. So in addition to being able to use that texture map as a bump, and the benefit there is, it highlights the edges for us to add scuff appearance. It also, in the dents and the dings, it kind of highlights that as well. And remember, this is only happening in the dark metal C version of the material, not in the others. Because I did test it in the rehearsal and it looked worse. The pixelation looked way worse up there. So that's one element of bump that we can add. I think down here, it does help. It does look better. But we can also incorporate procedural materials. Now, this is where shading gets, the rabbit hole deepens pretty hard, and also the flexibility opens big time. So Blender comes with textures that are called procedural textures. They are computer-generated mathematic algorithms and patterns that we can use to shade with, all right? So why I would want that in this particular case is, this is a medieval type sword, so it's probably going to have been made by a blacksmith with a hammer, not by a machined factory, all right? So there's going to be imperfection, and specifically, I want this hammered look. And we can achieve that with a texture, Voronoi texture, right? That is a pattern. If you followed my tutorials much, love the Voronoi texture. It's got a lot of uses. In fact, today we're going to use it for 2 different situations. First, it's going to be this hammered look. So if we take the Voronoi texture, first thing we need to do is add a texture coordinate, all right? Each node has texture coordinates by default, but they're not visible. So like with a texture, an image texture, it uses the UV coordinates of your model if they exist. And that's why this is working automatically. But if we want to explicitly state what texture coordinate, we can, using Node Wrangler, when that's enabled, you can hit Control-T, and that will reveal the texture coordinate and also this mapping node that you can use to manipulate. But this is, we're using the UVs as the vector to apply the texture to the model. However, with a Voronoi, and the other procedurals, if I hit Control-T, it's using the generated socket, all right? Because it doesn't necessarily need UVs. You can use UVs, but you don't need it because it works in like this 3D space kind of thing. It's really powerful, and you don't have to worry about seams, all right? So let's just Shift-Control-Click on Voronoi to see what we're talking about. The generated coordinates is actually not what I want in this case. I'm going to use object instead. And I don't think I'm going to have time to do an in-depth explanation for what these coordinates are. We'd cover that in other courses, but I think it's just going to be a confusing rabbit hole here. Basically, use object, and it will apply the pattern very evenly across the surface, as you can see. And this pattern, you might be wondering, how in the world is this going to be hammered effect. Well, if you remember what a bump does, it takes the light values and makes them push up, and then it takes the dark values and push in. We've got this pattern of cells and ridges that will definitely look like a bump. So let me just try to explain and just show you with a vector bump node. We can combine bumps, so that's why I'm using it separately. But anyway, that's why I did that. And we'll plug it not into the normal socket, but into the height value. Okay, that's the socket that will convert this to the proper bump information. Again, I want it to be a more subtle value, and 0.1 will start there. And now you can start to see that hammered effect come into play. Though I will manipulate it a little bit. It's a little too rigid, you know, like too geometric is kind of the term. I want it to be a softer bowl in between the ridges. And to do that, I'm going to add a converter color ramp before the bump, but after the Voronoi, and then change the interpolation to B-spline. And now when I drag the black flag up, you can see that the bowl, let me increase the strength just so you can see it. The bowl at the bottom kind of spreads out and softens. All right, so now that's what I mean by bowl, like in the middle of the ridges. Let's change the value back to 0.1 and plug that into the bump by itself, into the normal socket. Shift Control click. And I did this on the treasure chest too, so if you've already seen that in the course, you will recognize this technique. But now it's a little bit too strong, I think, but you can see the effect that I'm going for. I could also drag that bowl value up a little bit more, that color ramp. There we go. And the strength should probably be like 0.05. There we go. I just want it to be a subtle accent to the shape. So it looks like it's been handmade, hammered, or so to speak. Now, as far as the Voronoi texture, I didn't really change the scale value, but if you want the cells to be smaller, you scale up. So I think that probably that makes a little bit more sense. And yeah, you can see how it looks on the pommel as well. It's looking pretty good. A question came in. Let me show this. If you added two textural coordinates set to the same value so you can see stuff, is that the same as connecting the output from the texture coordinate node to the other nodes? If you added two texture coordinates to the same value, I don't quite know what you mean. If you just mean, like, you can definitely mix these values if you wanted. Like, I mean, you can do it with just a mix RGB, I think. So, like, you can mix the object and the UV, if that's what you mean. There's not too many scenarios where I do that, though. Question. So why not do that to the sword as... Greg, sorry, I didn't really finish. If you can... Oh, wait, did someone else already answer you? Oh, about the question. Greg, if I did not answer that question, if you can clarify exactly what you mean, if you can, you were pretty descriptive, but I don't quite understand. Is that the same as connecting the output from the texture coordinate to the other nodes? Yeah, I don't quite understand what you mean, but if you can clarify, I'd like to try again. If your network is all messed up, then create two texture coordinates. Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, I think I see what you mean now. So you can just use the one texture coordinate. Like, I can get rid of this and use object from here and plug it into the mapping. You can do that, but sometimes when your nodes, I think this is cleaner personally to do it this way, but sometimes when your node networks are huge, then it doesn't hurt to just go ahead and add another texture coordinate node. Like if I've got a bunch of textures down here, it can be cumbersome to like zoom in, grab the node, and try and drag it all the way over here. It's just easier to duplicate and drag it again, or drag it closer. So there was a question, William Miller, why not do that to the sword as well? Yeah, valid point, and I don't want to do it to the blade. Why? The reason why is I do want there to be a little bit of a variety. You know, like even though you could reason that maybe the swordsmith hammered this as well, that's very likely. I feel like the blade would be the most precise part of this type of sword. You know, the handle doesn't need to be sharp. It doesn't need to cut anything, so you can be a little bit more broad or rough with how you make those hammer marks. Whereas on the blade, you would want that to be the sharpest. However, with the centerpiece, it's a storytelling element perhaps to add that hammered effect to the middle, because that doesn't need the same precision as the blade. So let's do that. I think that's a good call. I can let's grab these nodes. It also helps to show how you can copy and paste parts of node networks to other shaders. I'm going to select all of my node components, Control Copy, Control C, and then jump over to my sword B, Control V to paste it. Maybe move those a little bit closer together. Something that you will want to, as you get into shading, shader creation this way, is quickly this can all become a mess of nodes. That's really hard to follow. And I tend to be faster creatively than I am organizationally. And it's always a struggle to stay organized, but try to be organized, because even if you open this same file later, like a month down the road, I find when I'm not organized, it's hard to even tell what's going on. So it is a good habit to at least, try and package things together, moving these closer together to suggest like these are related, that kind of thing. That's really all I'm trying to do there. So this becomes the normal of sword B as well. And yeah, I think that looks pretty good. It definitely breaks up the reflections again, which is a good thing. I always am a fan of that. I might, just to make it different from this one, I might make it a little more subtle, like 0.02. Maybe make it broader as well, like the size, take that down. There we go. But, William, I think it was a good idea to incorporate that into the blade there, at that specific spot. Is it possible to make one material fade into another? Absolutely, you can do that. Let me save this file. So, how to make them fade into the other? What you will typically want to do is, I'll do this by, let me take sword A, and you can copy all of these nodes, excluding the material output. All right, I can copy that, Control C, go to sword B. Let me get a drink of water quickly. So I'm at sword B now. I can Control V and move that out of the way. All right, so now I've essentially got the two materials together in one material. And then you can mix the BSDFs, which are the green nodes, that's your shader nodes. You can mix that with a shader mix shader. Okay, and when we plug those two into it, by default, we've got a 50-50 mixture, and you can change that to be closer to 0, so the first material, or closer to 1. And this is a very small example, but like you can see how that's fading in and out. You can also plug in a texture to control how those materials blend together. You used to do this all the time whenever you added like a diffuse component, a glossy BSDF component for a type of plastic, and you would always add a mix shader. So you used to do the mix shader a lot more. With the principal BSDF being present, I find myself doing it a lot less because it combined all of these properties into one. But yeah, you can definitely mix two shaders together. All right, let me just get rid of that. All right. So we covered the metal C material. I think we were pretty much done with that. Yeah, now let's move on to the leather. What time is it? Okay, good, making decent time. For organization, is it possible to rename or label nodes? Yes, it absolutely is. That is a more appropriate, it's a powerful way of organizing, a more powerful way to organize rather than just position the nodes correctly. So I'll quickly do how I think of organization. Oh, it's going to come up actually in the leather material. So let me get to that, and then I'll talk more about how to organize. Any way to make a blur and sharpen like in Photoshop or other drawing program? Not really. I don't know about sharpen. I did come up with a way to blur materials. I haven't tested it, blur a texture. I haven't tested it with Eevee. But N64, can you remind me at the end, once I finish like the main portion, and then, because I think that's a little more advanced, and so I'll show you that if you remind me towards the end of the stream, once I start wrapping things up, asking if there's any questions. If you can remind me, I will definitely go over that. I'll definitely test it. Okay. What was I doing? Right, so the leather material. Let us start with, let's start with metal C. I think I can use these components to achieve the leather pretty good. So I'm going to add a new slot, go select metal C and duplicate that one and call it control click on it and call it leather. Sword leather, I suppose. So the naming convention you can see is like I kind of add, usually I add the name of the object at the start of the material and then what kind of material it is after that. In case this object was full of multiple objects, that have multiple types of metal, at least now I know that I created these for the sword specifically. So that's, another organizational practice to develop really on your own. And sword leather, let's dive in there. So the biggest difference with metal and leather is that leather has no metal in it, all right? So it's not a metallic type of reflection. So when you have plastics or polyurethane wood, glass even, a brick wall, like most materials that are reflective for one, even if they're really low reflectivity, and it's typically not metallic, it's specular. That's the other type of reflection. So we will want to turn metallic all the way down, and specular is going to be how we increase that. Now I haven't actually assigned the material to the leather portions yet, so let me do that in edit mode. Whoops. Shift Alt clicking, and then Control plus to grow the selection and assign the sword leather. All right, so now you can see that the specular, as we go up and down, we get a very different type of reflection. So I'll quickly illustrate what the difference is. Let me save this file, and I'm going to add a mesh monkey head. In case you're wondering, like, what's the difference between metallic and specular? I'm going to right-click Shade Smooth and Control 3 to add 3 levels of subdivision and add a new material, and I'm going to call this gold. All right, so the way we get to gold, we're going to turn specular all the way off, metallic all the way up, and then the base color is going to be a goldish type orangey yellow. All right, so that's our gold, and then the roughness we want to make much lower. All right, so it's a more reflective type of gold material, the gold metal. Now, when we duplicate this up, and I duplicate the material, let's call this not gold. All I'm going to do is turn metallic all the way down and specular all the way up. And it looks extremely different. All right, so this looks more like plastic and this looks more like metal. All right, that's essentially the big difference. It's almost like there's an underlying color and then a clear coat on top of that is kind of what specular is like. Metallic takes the reflections and colors the reflections to be the base color. That's how I understand it. So anyway, very big difference when you actually see them side by side using almost the exact same input. We'll get rid of that. And that's why for leather, we want specular and not metallic. Question, can you save? Yes, I can definitely save. Thank you. It looks more like a brassy bronze. That's fair enough. Any other questions? That's the warning. Thank you. Save. Thank you. Save police. All right, now for the leather specifically, we do not want it to be that reflective. All right, we want it to, and certainly not that clear of a reflection. This is going to be more subtle. We can unplug the normal for now because I'll get to that in a little bit, but we do want to alter how reflective areas are using our texture. So I'm going to, let's see, which one should I start with? Let's start with this color ramp, which comes from our texture, and it will be plugged into the specular. But let's look at it by itself. How about we reset it? Do the delete key. All right, so as it is just black and white from the original texture, it's a darker gray color. So that means our specular value is going to be lower. That's good because the specular that we kind of ended at is pretty low on the spectrum. All right, so we want the majority of it to be dark, but thinking about where it would be most reflective, it's going to be most reflective in the middle, right? Because towards the edges and where it connects in the crevice, that's where dirt and grime is going to gather, that kind of thing. So we can drag, let's see. But what we have is going to work pretty well. So we might be able to just plug in that to our specular value, see what that looks like by itself. And if we drag the black up, you'll see that it kind of disappears. It disappears really quickly, so it's a pretty sensitive color ramp. Ah, that's why, because it's so dark, of course, yeah. Let me switch to B-spline so that it's automatically a little more subtle. Yeah, something more like this is what I'm after. Frankly, the white flag can probably stay up. All right, so that should work well as the specular. All right, now it's way too clear, so let's focus instead on the roughness and find a good value for that. I am going to want it to be higher, I think. Not so shiny, but like a more dull. There we go. That's starting to feel more like leather. Okay, so what value is that? 0.386. Now if we look at the color ramp, let's reset it so that we can, again, incorporate the variety. It's always good to incorporate a variety into these values. Just a global reflective or roughness value is, frankly, it's lazy and doesn't look as realistic. It doesn't, real life doesn't really happen that way. So it's very simple for us. It's like the smallest thing we can do to use the color information from a texture to gain that variety. All right, so we want most of it to be in a roughness value of 0.386. So let's take that dark value and change it to 0.4 just to, get close. Keep these numbers round. And then the upper value, maybe that'll be fine actually. Let's plug that in. Let's just see what that looks like. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. So, we've got a couple scratches that we painted into the surface, and those are showing up in the reflections. And yeah, this is well on its way. Certainly good for now to move on to the next step, which is the bump map. We're going to, again, use a procedural, and we're going to use specifically the Voronoi texture, because if we invert the values, right, the way it worked for the hammered metal, I want the opposite effect. So let's look at that Voronoi texture, and let's just flip around the flags like this. Okay, so now we've inverted it, and if we take the scale way up, that's going to make it a smaller pattern. And you can see that the white kind of bubbles are going to represent leather quite well. So let's plug that really subtle valued bump into our normal socket. See what that looks like. Not bad. Definitely affecting the reflections this way is a positive. Yeah, I definitely think that reads like leather. We can maybe increase the value to let's try 0.1. I do want it to maybe stand out a little bit more. Maybe not that much. 0.75. Oh, 0.075. Is that it? What am I doing? 0.075. There we go. All right, now, but we can also use this material, this texture, to influence our color. All right, so let's. This is where organization can start to become necessary. So I can take this value here and plug it, and I want to use that as an overlay for the color texture. So I want to add a color mix RGB. All right, and from here I can take this value, plug it in, multi-purpose this procedural texture as a overlay. All right, let's look at that. Now you can see that it's affecting the color. It's darkening the crevices around the bubbly pattern, but then brightening the bubbles themselves. All right, so this makes sense to incorporate that way. But now we've got this noodle like cutting behind. Looks like there's a couple questions. I'll get to those. Let me just a second. But these nodes are starting to cut behind other nodes, and it's become. You can imagine that this becomes hard to read. So a way to organize this would probably be, first of all, in this specific case, a reroute node. So if you hold shift and then right click and drag, that will add a little socket that you can use to manipulate the shape of the noodle. So let me add another one, and then I can move that with G. Shift, do that again up here. And now this helps a little bit better, like show the flow of this particular node, and then maybe move this one above. So now, you can start to organize these nodes a little bit better to be more readable. In addition, you can add labels to certain nodes and group them. So if I select all these nodes that are representative of the bump portion of the material, let me add, how did we do this again? Well, the default way to do it is by adding a layout frame node, and that will just create this box. But then if I shift and click all of these and drag one into the box then houses that entirely. With the node wrangler, I think Alt P, no. Oh, I forgot. Does anyone know with the node wrangler how to remove the frame node? If anyone can answer me that'd be great. From Blanche, I guess my next question is: once this is all said and done with Eevee, and this is all output fine to a game engine like Unity, for example, wouldn't this particular sword cost a lot of processing power with all of the shading and texturing? Yes. In the case of a game, I would want to optimize this. I'm not going to be able to export all of these nodes out to a game engine. I'm going to have to bake those down to textures, and that's where a lot of efficiency will be gained, taking all these procedurals and applying them in texture form, for one, so that those details can exist outside of Blender. But I'm not really making this as a game project per se, not specifically. I'm just creating the asset in Blender, kind of. I don't have a bigger purpose for this outside of that, but that's just for teaching how to create stuff. That's kind of a whole other subject for how to get it into a game engine, how to make it more efficient for that purpose. But it's not really the goal for this class particularly. But you're right that this is not the most efficient way to do it for a game. You're right about that. Do you happen to know what's the point of making image textures share data now? If you duplicate the image texture node, it gets the to user tag. I guess the only purpose of it is that I have the same texture being used for multiple materials. That's the only reason it's sharing data, because it is using that exact same texture between the materials. But to me, that just makes sense. So maybe I don't understand the question about what's the point, Omar. If you can clarify, I'd be happy to answer that. Alt P. Okay, that's what I thought it was. Didn't I say Alt P? So go back to sword leather. Alt P. That doesn't seem to work with Node Wrangler anymore. I'm sorry. It's not. I don't select the frame node. I select all the nodes within the frame, and then Alt P. That's what I do. I thought. Yes, it's true. Okay, so it was unparented. Anyway, to do that with Node Wrangler, I believe it's Control P. Control P. All right. Does anyone know the hotkey for doing it with Node Wrangler to add all these to a frame? I thought it was Control P or just regular P. Shift P? Shift P. There it is. Okay, there we go. So Shift P is how you can quickly add a frame node around selected nodes. All right, so that took a lot longer than I thought. But what we can do with a frame node is add a label. So we can call this normal nodes. And, oh wait, that's the name. I can also control copy and paste this to the label, and now that shows up. We can change the color to be maybe a purpley color to represent the fact that this is a normal set of nodes. Normal textures usually have this purple color. Also, we can, there's not a ton of nodes going on up here, but you could like select these, I guess, and Shift P, and we can call this color specifically, and maybe make that yellow because that's that's the type of socket that we've been using. But you can see how now we can organize this and move the collection of nodes around as we wish. Personally, I've never been able to come up with like a really standard way of organizing. Usually I will group some nodes, group other nodes, add a reroute node here and there, but there's also nodes that don't really need to be grouped. For example, this one, there's no real point to just add a frame node around this one, for example. Anyway, so that's a brief, prolonged explanation for how to organize this. But what time is it? All right, we'll be wrapping this up well, fairly soon. All right, I think that's it. I added the color, that's right, the Voronoi to the color of the leather. And that should mean we're done with our leather material. All right, you can see that that little accent to the color makes the leather pattern stand out a bit better. And I think this definitely reads well as leather. All right, so this means we are done with the shader creation portion. And we can move on for the next 20 minutes or so to finalize a render, do a tiny bit of compositing, and we'll be done with this project. So I will save and then save a new version of the scene. So I have a mile marker. And yeah, I guess next thing to do for rendering specifically. Oh, reminder that NSNC has a question. Thank you for reminding me. Question from Concrescence: why not just use the hammered effect for the leather? Because I don't think leather would incorporate the hammered effect that metal has. I can maybe see that if you're asking, like, if it's hammered metal underneath and you wrap leather really tightly, would it incorporate that? I didn't really see it that way. I saw it as more of a very cylindrical type, or maybe it's really thick leather and that's why it's not incorporating the underlying shape. But to me, that seems most appropriate for the metal, less so for the leather. Let's see, there is a NC, looking for NC. I'm not seeing that other question from NSNC had a question. I don't see that question, Laszlo. If you can either copy and paste that for me, that would be helpful. When I was texturing Bob, actually, the Gorilla Ninja Turtle, I duplicated the image texture node to plug it into the normal socket. I changed that one to non-color data, and I didn't realize that when it duplicated, the other texture image nodes were changed as well. And that was plugged into the color socket, so the color was going wonky, and I didn't know why. Later, I realized it was duplicating the node. Oh, okay, I see what you mean. Well, if your texture is non-color data, I don't think you can use the same texture for both purposes. Either your texture should be in it should be color data, like where do we change that? I forget. Flat. Yeah, so the color space is typically going to be sRGB, unless you use a normal map specifically, and that's a non-color data type of texture. But I don't think changing this to non-color data will make it work better as a normal map. So I see why you ran into that problem, but you should just really have your own normal texture that's separate from this one. All right. So we finished the shading, but all I want to do now, I saw someone say, didn't he wrap it up? That we're not quite done. I want to render a final image and then do a touch of compositing. So that's what we're going to do now. In order to render, you need a camera. So let's add a camera. All right, Shift A and just choose camera. And I'm going to hit 0 on my number pad, and that's how I look into the camera's perspective. And then I want to enable in my in panel, go to the View tab and choose Lock Camera to View. And then when I orbit around my viewport, the camera is going to move accordingly. It's like I'm moving my camera with viewport controls. All right, so I just want to set this up so I can see my sword at an, I want it to fill kind of diagonally in the frame. And then once I like it, I think it's pretty evenly balanced. We can turn off Lock Camera to View. You want to do that because once you start moving around the viewport, you'll change the camera angle that you like. So we can save this, and Yeah. Um, right, Jake. Yeah, I was following that much, but I wasn't sure why that was a problem, I guess. Unless it was just something to be aware of. Like when you duplicate a texture node, it's going to keep that link, I guess. Um, we've set up the camera. Now we need to move from our look dev. Remember, we've just been using this look dev mode. And you can't actually render look dev mode, which I think would be nice if we could. You can do a view. I guess you could do a view viewport render image. All right, that will create exactly what an image form of what you see in the viewport. I guess in that way you could render it. But we're not really looking to do that. We want to render properly, so to speak. And we can only do that through the rendered viewport shading. And you can see that we don't have any environment lighting anymore. So that's going to be the first thing we need to add. We cannot, basically, I guess my slight complaint is that I can't use the HDRIs included with Blender as worlds for our render engine. I think that would be convenient. But we have to create our own. So the way to do that is you go to the World tab, and we're going to click on Color and choose Environment Texture specifically. Now, with that done, you're going to get this bright pink color. And it's going to, anytime you see that pink color, what it means is that Blender is trying to source a texture, but it can't find the path. And that's exactly the case here. So don't freak out when you see the pink color. It's just a soft warning that it's missing a texture. And so in this case, it's missing the environment texture that we told it to source. So let's go to the Open button and choose an HDRI. Now, HDRIs, quickly, what those are, they're pictures that fit a 3D sphere. And they're pictures of an environment, whether it's a room or outside or at night. It gives you a lot of lighting and like environment information for free. And remember, your textures, your shaders that have reflection need an environment in order to reflect. So that's why we need an HDRI. Now, where to find HDRIs? If we go to my browser, and I highly recommend hdrihaven.com because these are completely free, 100% free, CC0 public domain licensed HDRIs by a very talented artist. I'm a Patreon supporter of HDRI Haven, so I mean, I use it so much. It's like, how can I not support this effort? So if you use it a lot, you should support it as well. HDRIs, you have a ton here, more than I feel like I would ever really need. But you've got studios, you've got indoor, you've got sky, outdoor. So for this particular project, maybe you would want something that feels medieval, so like an indoor. I know there was one here that I liked. It kind of looked like in a stone tower sort of room. This one could probably work. Pump house. Remember, we're not gonna be rendering the environment explicitly, but it's just going to be seen in the reflections and in the lighting. So this is sort of important, but really not that important. You can use any of these, even a vintage museum or this kind of gym, just for the sake of lighting. You don't have to get a medieval looking one, but I know here it is right here. Mutianyu. This, it kind of looks medieval. It looks like a tower, so let's go with that one. And I already downloaded that, so if we go back to Blender, and I have them collected in my CC0 HDRI Haven folder. Here it is, Mutianyu 1K. Let's click on that. And now we see the HDRI in the background. We also see it influencing our lighting. All right, so this is great. We can, if we want to manipulate how the HDRI is lighting the scene, we can do that with in our shader editor. Go to the, instead of object, which is default, that's where we've been so far, let's go to the world context, and you'll see that we have our texture plugged into a background into the world output. So just like we did in our normal shader, hit Control T, and that will bring up texture coordinates, which conveniently has this mapping node that we can rotate. This gives you 3D control over your texture and how, or the vector data specifically. And all you really need to know is that we can use this to like rotate the world around, for example. And you can see that updating on our model. Now, I don't actually want to see the background because it's pixelated. You know, it's not, it looks like the sword is just floating in midair. So I don't actually want to see that. Instead, to turn that off, I can go to our Eevee render settings and change the film to transparent. Okay, and now we just see the effect that that's having on our model. So it's very similar to look dev at this point. And so I'm going to look in my camera, and what I want to do now is just rotate around this HDRI to get an appealing light setup. So I know that rotating around in Z is going to be my first step. And all I'm looking, and so let me try and explain like how I am analyzing what to look for. One thing I know I don't want to be the case about the render is, and this particular object, because sword is not maybe ideal for rendering. It's you know, it's hard to like use classic principles of lighting on this, but I'm going to do my best. And I know that I don't want it to look two-dimensional. It's very easy to get a two-dimensional look. Like let me see. Where I know this map has a potential for that. Let me see here. I think this is it. It's not, it doesn't look exactly like my rehearsal, so I'm kind of going off the cuff, but I know that I want a rim light to be effective here. Okay, so I want it to highlight the edges of my model. And if I rotate this around, eventually, like right now, we start to see a rim light effect. All right, so that is nice, and that's a good, it's a good lighting principle. You like a good rim light. It also helps it to feel a little more three-dimensional because this underside of the cross guard is lit, but then the upper side of the crossbar is not. Okay, so I want it to feel 3D. I don't want to risk this thing feeling flat. It could easily feel that way being such a flat, long object. Okay, so that's something I'm also keeping in mind. We don't only have to rotate in the Z-axis, though. We can also rotate in Y. So if I click and start dragging Y, for example, now we can get more illumination on the upper side. So this is starting to feel pretty good. What about X? Let's see. Now that looks kind of cool too. So what the benefit of this is it changed, we still have a little bit of rim light down here, but we also have a lot more illumination on the blade that's showcasing that detail that we put into the shader. You can see that the edges are being highlighted much more. There's still reflectivity, so it obviously looks metal. That's another problem is if I change this rotation, like right now, the blade doesn't look metallic at all. Like there's nothing in the environment hitting the surface of the blade to make it feel metallic. So these values are working out, which is like, let's see, negative 100, let's say 33. And I don't know why I'm at 800, but whatever, negative 833. All right, so for some round numbers. So this looks pretty good, I think. Like this is about the simplest lighting setup you can do. I'm not, back in the day, several years ago and definitely before that, you know, lamps were really important for knowing all the different types of lamps. But nowadays, it's pretty rare that I use lamps. I usually default to HDRI lighting because you can do so much. The quality is really good these days, and we have a resource like HDRI Haven that makes it easy to license the use of those textures. So when you're getting started for this project, I recommend you go simple this route and don't worry about lamps and things like that, unless you want to play with them, but I'm not planning to cover those. I know I'm missing some question. What is the plan for the Sheep It group? Is it already there? Yeah, so I am planning to write an article about the Sheep It project for CG Cookie specifically. I just haven't had time to sit down and write that, and but I will do that. The group exists. You can find it. I think we're pretty high up on the list, but you can find CG Cookie Monsters in the list of render teams and ask to join if you have an account, and I will happily add you. But I'm going to write an article about exactly how anyone on CG Cookie can do that. Just haven't quite had the time yet. I know I missed a couple other questions. Let me find those. Can you show where to set the rendering to use the GPU in 2.8? certainly. I think that is only applicable, whoops, in cycles, I believe. If anyone can correct me, I would also love to know that information. But as far as I know, you cannot tell Eevee to specifically use your GPU. I think it's going to, keep hitting the wrong thing. It's going to do that automatically. But in cycles, if we switch over there, you'll see that we have a pretty consistent, for one, we have a pretty consistent render visibility. Not 100%, but pretty consistent. And here you can change your compute device from CPU to GPU. But we don't get that for Eevee. And also the only other place I'm aware of to control the GPU is in your edit preferences. Up at the top, your, well, this is, again, cycles render devices. So I think, again, it only works for cycles. And I have a CUDA enabled GeForce RTX 2080. And yeah, that's the only other place I know to deal with your GPU. So back to Eevee. Did I miss anything else? I don't think so. Okay, cool. All right. I mean, I think Eevee is using video, like your GPU, but not like as focused as Cycles does. So I could be wrong, but I don't know. I'm not exactly sure if your GPU has a massive effect on Eevee the way it does on Cycles. And if anyone knows better, then why not enable both video cards? Edit preferences, open CPL. Oh, interesting. I don't have two video cards. That's my CPU. I don't really think I knew you could do that. You can enable, I don't know what that would do. I need to look into that more, but I'm not familiar with that setting. All right, I'm going to try and finish this up in the next few minutes. So I'm kind of fast tracking the lighting. There's a lot to discuss about lighting. It's a whole nother subject. Like, there are professional lighters only. But I'm just trying to fast track it and enable you to get a appealing looking render as quick as possible. So we've set up a world. We've got our lighting enabled. Now I'm going to move on to actually rendering it and then doing some subtle tweaks in the compositor. I keep clicking that. Control S to save. Now to actually render, if we look at our output settings, the default is 1920 by 1080, and that should be fine for us. So, oh, there are some Eevee settings though to go over first. Number one, I kind of turn these on automatically, is ambient occlusion. There's really very little reason to not have that enabled. If we turn that on and off, it might be hard to see exactly what it's doing, but ambient occlusion darkens in the crevices. It creates contact shadows. But I usually find that the default ambient occlusion is a little too subtle for my taste, so I like to crank the factor up to like 0.15, if not, I'm sorry, to 1.5, if not 2. And then if we turn that on and off to, again, see what's happening, if we look in the viewport, it should be a little more obvious, the fact that if I change maybe the distance, there we go. You can see how the darkness grows out from this area. Let's see. Where can I best show that? Here, you can see how it's darkening there. That's the point of ambient occlusion. Again, here, maybe it's not as pronounced, but you really just want to turn it on. Like, anytime you have multiple objects in your scene, ambient occlusion is going to be a no-brainer. Also, we can enable screen space reflections. This one is a really powerful one. I'm going to simply, that's not the right one, screen space reflections. When we turn that on, wow, really? Okay, there we go. So notice how all of a sudden the upper part of the blade is not visible in the crossbar, because it only reflects, by default, it only reflects the environment. It doesn't reflect other geometry. So when you enable screen space reflections, it will enable other geometry in the reflections. So that one, to me, another no-brainer. It can be complex, so if you have a dense scene, that can slow down your render, or Eevee in general. But for this project, I highly recommend you turn it on. And then the only other one is bloom. All right, so what bloom does, you can see if I turn it on and off, it takes the brightest parts of your mesh, of your model or render, and gives them a subtle glow around it. So it's like a camera effect for making something feel like really light intensity. And so by clicking that on, I mean, I'm probably going to leave it at the default because I think that looks nice. But you have a bunch of controls here. You can the threshold for how bright the area needs to be in order to glow. The intensity itself, like I'm going to change this to like 0.1 just to make it a little brighter. I find that how it looks in the viewport is a little more subtle in the actual render. But you can change the color. I'm just going to leave it pretty much at default. But this provides some nice simple camera effects for our render. Definitely showcases that the blade is shiny, which I think looks nice. And then I'm going to Control Save. And now we can actually do a render image. Let me scale, render view render. Trying to scale this window down. There we go. All right, anyway, here's my render, okay? So you can see that the glow seems to have disappeared. I'm not really sure why that is because it should appear in the composition, but here we've got a 1920 by 1080 version of our render. Now we can take that into compositing because I don't want to leave the background transparent. You know, I want it to have a little bit of color and have a background. We're going to add a vignette. So this is all common stuff that if you've watched my stuff, my streams or courses before, you've seen already. But in case you haven't, I'll go over the essential compositing effects that I add. All right, so that's our render. We're ready to then jump into our compositing workspace. We're going to enable use nodes, and we have our render layers, but we don't actually see the render. In order to make that visible, we're going to hit Shift-Control-Click just like we did in the shader editor. Shift-Control-Click on render layers will show us our, the render in the background. I'm going to get rid of the end panel and don't need the timeline either. So for navigating around your background image, if you hit the V hotkey, V as in Valentine's, that will zoom out of your render. Alt V will zoom in, and then holding Alt middle mouse clicking is how you can move it around. So I'm going to just make it a little bit smaller so that we can see behind the nodes. And then so I don't really know why this is two different things. I never have with Blender, but you've got a composite output, which is default, and now we've got the viewer from hitting Shift-Control clicking. So you have to have a viewer in order to see in your composition, in your node editor, but you have to have it plugged into composite for it to actually render out. Kind of funny. But I'm going to hit Shift, right-click, and draw a line between both noodles, and that's going to add a reroute node between both of them. So this makes it easy to have one input split to multiple areas. All right, so the first thing I want to do is, again, add a color to the background. I'm going to hit Shift-A, add color, and not mix. I'm sorry, I don't want mix. I want color alpha over. Okay, so when I plug that in, I want to put my image on the second slot, which is going to be on top of the first slot. So the image right now is white, or the color is white, which is not terribly appealing. This is where we have the opportunity to pick a more appealing, non-distracting background color. You can make it whatever you want. I think darker works better for this project. So when I need a darker background, I find that most other colors look a little weird. You know, like red looks a little brown, for example. Purple looks okay, but I find that a navy blue tends to work the best. So I like navy blue, and now we can see that the glow is still there. It's just more subtle. I don't know why it's more subtle in the render than in the viewport, but I think it definitely is. Next thing to add is, well, there's a couple things. Let's just add a vignette, for example. So the idea of vignette is that it happens in cameras, I think, or at least it's used in photography, but it also can happen naturally in cameras where it's darker around the edges, but it's lighter in the middle. All right, so it kind of focuses your eye to the center of the image. And it's just a nice technique to kind of finish off your renders. Right now, as a solid color, it just doesn't look very finished. Once we see the vignette, I think you should agree that it looks more finished. To do this, I'm going to use a matte ellipse mask. Okay, so if we Shift-Control-Click on that, you can see it's just a circle. And if I hit V to see our whole frame, I'm going to stretch it out, whoops, so that it kind of creates a circle around the middle of the image. Something like this. Then let me add a filter blur node. This is going to be, I set to fast Gaussian. I've never had to use really any other blur. It computes much faster than the others. So X and Y, I'm going to use 100. And then I usually change it to 100 for a broad blur, and then use the size as a multiplier. So when I switch that to 3, it's really, I'm pretty sure it's like blurring 300. But let's try 5. Okay, this is I like a vignette to be subtle too. I don't want it to be overly dark on the edges and noticeable. You kind of want a vignette to be more subtle rather than very explicit. So with that plugged in, we can incorporate it a couple ways. I can add a color mix node and add the blurred vignette in the second color slot and change the mix type to be overlay. And now when we look at that, you can see that it's darker around the edges, lighter in the center. If we turn that on and off with the M hotkey, which is the mute hotkey, you can do this in the shader node as well to temporarily, or I guess permanently, mute the effect of a node. Just M on and off. All right, so that it looks nice, that the fact that the outer edges are dark and the interior is light, our eye is naturally focused then to the center of the image. So this is one way to incorporate it. Sometimes I'll do this, but in this particular case, I only want it to affect the background color. I want the vignette to be part of the background, but not affect the sword element. So to do that, I am going to use this overlay and Control C over top of the blue color and paste it into slot 1 of the overlay mix. All right, so now I can plug that into the color slot of the alpha over. Shift Control click on that. And now the vignette only affects the background, not the sword at all. Now, what other things can we add? You'll find that, the same way, I kind of treat this the way people use Instagram filters, for example. Like you take a normal picture and then you want to spice it up a little bit. So that's all we're really doing in this case. We're not doing anything more special than that. Compositing does get a lot deeper and you can do very technical things with the render, but we're not doing that in this project. So we added the bloom effect in the Eevee settings. We can also add that in compositing as well with a couple different options. So if I add a Shift A filter glare node, you'll see what happens is we add these streaks to the bright areas, right? It highlighted the bright areas and added these streaks, but we can do a ghost effect. We can do, which is kind of like a lens flare. We can do simple star is the one that I'm going for. All right, because I think that has a nice painterly sort of stylized, I think of like ding, this is shiny. That's what it makes me think of. And so that I think is a nice stylistic choice for this particularly. To see exactly what is getting the brightness, we can change the mix to 1, and that will show just the brightest areas. So you can see the edges of the blade and up top. That's the only part that's getting the additional glare. And I think I will leave that at 0 because that's the mixture of both. And so yeah, I think that looks nice. It just highlights the shininess of the blade. It might be a little too strong. What if we, let's see, the fade. What if we turn that to like 0.5? Wow, so the fade only goes to 0.75. I'm going to right click and reset to the default value. Didn't seem to work. I guess it's fine. I won't worry about dimming it. I think that works okay. The only other thing I want to add, and then we'll call it a day, is a little bit of lens distortion or dispersion. All right, so it's a camera effect that does work well for making your renders look a little more realistic or like it was taken with a camera. So it's really nice for realism. Sometimes it can be a deciding factor to make something look photorealistic, because most of your photos, well, I say most, I'm pretty sure that it's just across all photo cameras, just depending on how strong the camera has the effect. Let me add it first. I'm doing a lot of talking. So is it distort and lens distortion is what I'm looking for. I'm going to plug the whole image into that. And dispersion, if we go to 0.1, so this is the effect. On the outer edges of the image, it starts to separate the color channels into a rainbow effect. All right, and this is what happens with a lens. You know, I think if you ever watch a movie, or so it's in video games now too, like if you look through a sniper scope, if it's like a war movie, or you look through binoculars and they're showing that in a film format, they always have this effect for like showing zooming almost. Well, it's because it just happens in lenses in general. Now, in this case, it's way too strong. I think it should be much more subtle, hardly noticeable, more of a subtle effect, just like the vignette. And now you can barely notice at 0.1, but if we zoom in, it is still happening. It's just much more subtle. And at a value of 0.01, maybe 0.02, this is about as subtle as I want it to be. I don't want to go stronger than this. Let's zoom back out. And it just adds a nice effect to the render, I guess. And you can also distort the actual image. So like in cameras with the round lens, it takes straight objects and like conforms them to a little bit of it distorts them to a round shape a little bit. So if we distort like 0.1, you can start to see that what's happening there. We don't want it to be 0.1. We want it to match the dispersion, so 0.02. And then if you check, you also might have noticed that at the higher values, it's breaking away the image and giving you these dark corners. So if you choose fit, it will stretch out your image to avoid that. So I want 0.02 with fit enabled. And I rarely do the distort, honestly. I usually only do dispersion, but maybe 0.01. Yeah, just a tiny bit. Perhaps the vignette is a little too strong, so add the factor of 1. How about we go down to 0.5? That is a more subtle vignette, maybe a little too subtle. 0.7. There we go. All right, so at this point, we have finished a final image. All right, it's better than just taking a screen grab. This is like a final showcase-worthy version of our asset that we can post online, post to our gallery, our portfolio, that kind of thing. That's the purpose of this. And I'm going to, save the file. That essentially means we're done. I feel like I missed some questions. So if you have any last-minute questions, feel free to ask them. I also feel like there was something I was supposed to do at the end of the stream. Maybe in 647. Did you ask me to do something? If you're still here, I can't remember, but I'll be happy to answer that. From Omar, what would you say is the best thing about making the jump from 2.79 to 2.8? The best thing, Eevee, without a doubt, is the best thing. The nun, as you call her. I was like you, Omar, I promise. Whenever I first got into Eevee, I thought it would be like a real-time Cycles. I really did. But Eevee is just a game engine. And now it makes sense after using Eevee, but to get the most out of Eevee, you need to treat it like a game engine. Meaning, like, in Cycles, you can subdivide a ground plane, like, to 1 million polygons, displace it with a procedural texture, add all kinds of reflection, and get global illumination happening, and Cycles just eats it up. Like, I mean, it's not fast, but Cycles takes all that complexity and is like, hold my beer. This is not a problem. It might take a long time, but like I can handle it. Whereas with Eevee, you've got to be much more efficient. You've got to treat it like a game engine and not like Cycles. And so when I started doing that, I started using Eevee for almost everything. And maybe it's a coincidence that the projects I've been working on have not been overly complex, and Eevee is more appropriate in those situations. But I do find that for like dialing in reflective values, for polishing shaders, Eevee is amazing for that. And I think Eevee will only get better. So anyway, I'm going on and on about Eevee. I do think Eevee is without a doubt the best part of 2.8. But Eevee could have been part of 2.79 too. So when I think of what else is good about 2.8, it feels like a modern version of Blender. It really does. Even though all the features are are not fully ported over to 2.8, I don't think. Like Wayne especially is very aware of like things that are lacking with 2.8, but it does feel like a modern version of Blender, the one that has a more expansive future. So I feel like it's good. 2.8 is a great step forward. A lot of people are interested in it, and it does just feel more professional a little bit. It feels like a better piece of software. So I think that only makes sense. You know, like development has improved, more people get involved, development fun gets bigger, and this is the result. So yeah, that's probably, I hope that's a decent answer for you. I'm curious about CryptoMat. I only know it's for compositing. Will there be a tutorial about it? Absolutely there will be. I need to learn more about CryptoMat myself because, again, being involved with Eevee and CryptoMat being fairly new, I've only looked into it one time and didn't really understand it. So I need to look into it more. We will definitely cover that. It's for like power compositing, like really advanced compositing techniques. From Blanche, I haven't noticed it. It is quite a bit more subtle on Eevee blooming render. Oh yeah, so you haven't. Are you saying you have not noticed it? I didn't. I just noticed it today when I was rehearsing. The fact that the bloom was much more subtle in the viewport than the in the render than it was in the viewport, and I have no idea why that's the case. All right, I think that's it that I've missed. See if there's any more questions. N647 asked you to show any way to make a blur and sharpen. That's right. Thank you for reminding me about that. Cool, yeah. All right, let me do that real quick. I think it should work with Eevee easy enough. Control, save. Let me just start a new scene. I'm going to add a... Let's just add a cube and switch to Look Dev. Go to Shading View. And let's see if we can blur a texture. Actually, I should just do this on the sword. Why not? Yeah, so we have a texture here. Let's do that. I'm going to just focus on the texture itself and see if we can blur it, because blurring textures can be a really nice asset if you are able to do it. There's not like an official way to do it in Blender. You kind of have to hack it, and I'm curious if that will be effective here or not. So if I just wanted to blur the texture that we created here, just blur it. Let's add, the way that I've done it in the past is, oh, I haven't done it in a while. I should think this through. How did I do this? It involves the vector data. So if I Control T to take the UVs and then yeah, that's right. So I'm going to remove this and I'm going to mix in a texture, noise texture with color mix RGB. So it's still a new revelation to me, the fact that you can use you can manipulate vector data with color nodes. All right, so I can take this noise texture and plug it into the color, mixing that noise with the vector, and look what it does to the texture. It like makes it crazy. All right, so if I scale that all the way, if I move the factor all the way down so it has no effect, and then gradually hold shift and drag it up, you'll see that it's just wonkifying the texture. All right, so if we change the scale value on the noise texture to be really, really high, like 10,000, for example, you can see that we get a blurred version of the texture that's really pixelated. All right, so I wonder if I can add another 0 and it'll start to be less pixelated. So that was my concern with Eevee, is does the pixelation ever like resolve? And it doesn't look like it resolves that much. But if I go all the way down, it does start to blur the texture a little bit. All right, so it's not perfect because you can see that it's also, I wonder if I change it to overlay. Yes, the overlay works better. Overlay is what you want. So with overlay as the blend type, the texture stays in the same location, it just blurs. You see that happening? Now, I can't say from experience if I render this out in an animation, will there be any artifacts? That might be a real problem with it. But with this simple test, it does seem to blur fairly well. So that's how to do that. Cool. If there's no other questions, have you ran into the UV layout stretching bug? Is it a setting problem? I'm not aware of a UV stretching layout bug. And I can't say I've run into anything like that myself. All right. I think that's it. I've kept you a solid 15 minutes over. So I think that's going to be it. I hope that was helpful, and I look forward to seeing your shading and lighting throughout the week. So many have good textures that are going to look amazing in the material, and I can't wait to see that happen. So best of luck to you. I will be available all week in the homework threads. I'll be keeping an eye out on things. I'll finish grading tomorrow. That's going to be my goal. I think I can do that. And I think that's it. Again, thank you to the volunteer assistants who are staying so present in everyone's threads and being super helpful. Appreciate you taking the time to do that. One more week, and then we're going to be done with the class. So let's make the last week a good one. And with that said, I'll let you guys go. Thank you, and I'll see you definitely next week to close out the class. Goodbye.